Welcome to today's webinar, Wetlands, Carbon, Climate Change, hosted by the Thompson-Nicola Conservation Collaborative. My name is Danielle Topizer, and I'm the Program Manager for the TNCC. We operate on the unceded territory of the Secwepemc, St'át'imc, Syilx, and the Coatlam and Tsilhqot'in nations. In case you don't know, TNCC supports the work of conservation partners, including Indigenous communities, governments, academia, stewardship groups, and more through communication, networking, and information sharing and expanding partner capacity. Thanks for joining us here today for our first webinar to kick off TNCC's webinar series. We're right at 12 o'clock. We're at 12:01 now, so without further delay, I think we will jump right into it. Thanks again for joining us. We do have 49 folks that have registered today, so that's amazing. We are slowly building on numbers, so maybe I'll just take a little pause here for a few moments and let those numbers continue to trickle in, and then we'll keep on with the next part. It would be great, as Ali's put into our chat, welcome, let us know who you are and your affiliation and where you're joining from today. So maybe before we dive into the webinar, we'll just do a little bit of housekeeping here. Please post any questions for our presenter using the Q&A on the chat. We'll address these questions after the presentation, and feel free to use the chat to make any further connections with any of your fellow participants today. And again, just please do let us know who you are and your affiliation and where you're joining today. We do have a quick poll as well. Please do feel free to fill that out. Always interesting to see who's joining and from where. Give it a few more minutes. A couple more answers trickle in here. That's great. If you haven't already filled out the poll, feel free to jot your number in or your answer in, and then we'll move on. All right, thanks for playing along. So let's dive into the webinar. As you know, wetlands play a key role in climate change mitigation and adaptation. They act as carbon sink and increase climate resilience by protecting against natural disasters such as floods and drought. We're happy to have you join today for an overview of wetland ecosystems and carbon sequestration in the face of climate change with Thompson Rivers University's Dr. Tom Pypker. Tom is chair of the Department of Natural Resource Sciences at TRU. His research focuses on how disturbance affects biophysical processes of managed ecosystems at scales ranging from the leaf to whole watersheds. Nationally and internationally, his work focuses on how management and climate change affect biophysical processes in a variety of ecosystems that range from Canada's subboreal forests and grasslands, north of Michigan's wetlands, mountains and ecosystems in Oregon, Washington and Colorado, to manage plantations in Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and Iran. His interdisciplinary work has covered the fields of hydrology, ecology, micrometeorology, and tree physiology. Thanks, Tom. We're happy to have you today. I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much and welcome everyone. I'm happy to be here. So yes, I'll be giving a sort of about a 30-minute talk discussing wetlands and climate change. Before I start, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm personally located on the unceded traditional territory of the KAMLOOPS of Secwepemc within Secwepemc-Ulu. And I often like to make sure we sort of place ourselves and think about, as we talk about land and land management, that these lands have been managed for millennia over time. And many of the issues we're talking about and the issues we're talking about today are really the result of choices made over the last 200 years. So there's lots to learn over time, and just think about that as we're working through our talk today. So for today's talk, I'm going to first give an overview of wetlands, just a general overview for the audience. And then we'll talk a little bit about climate change and its pressures on wetlands. And then more specifically, I really would like to talk about how climate change may be affected by the fate of wetlands. So these ecosystems are not just being pressured by wetlands, but in fact may be the key to climate change in the future as well. So on this image here, what I have is a wetland, just a little cartoon showing sort of the general function of wetlands. And the two key drivers for wetland development and sustaining wetlands are the hydrology and climate. And obviously, I know this is sort of straightforward that, yes, we need water for a wetland, but I would like to stress the key component of the hydrology, and shifts in that hydrology will have pretty dramatic effects. And when I used to live in Michigan, I used to drive between the town I lived in Houghton to another town called Marquette, and the highway had intersected multiple wetlands, and the Ministry of Transportation tried to fix some of the wetlands on the side that was dewatered, and they put in beautiful looking wetlands with logs on it for turtles to bask on, but there was no water in it. So the one thing they didn't think about was actually supplying water to the wetlands. I just really want to stress, mistakes have been made many times when working with wetlands, and the key part is to make sure you got the hydrology right in terms of driving what type of wetland will be present. So wetlands do a lot of functions, and Danielle talked about this a little bit at the beginning. They dissipate stream energy. So water moving into a wetland generally slows down. This allows for sediment losses into the wetland itself. Contaminants in that water can be removed by the biology within the system. And the wetlands themselves act as a big sponge and hold water and then slowly release it over time to the ecosystem. So they act as sort of a storage bank for later in the season. And this is quite critical in BC because most of our watersheds are driven by a spring freshet. When the snow melts, we get a massive surge of water moving through the system. And then in systems, especially where I'm located in the interior, we go through a very dry season in the summer. And wetlands in the landscape can act as this little reservoir to supply water going forward. So what we have here in this image here is pictures of different types of wetlands. So wetlands can have different ways they get their water. So the top image on the, for example, on the top is a flow-through wetland where you have GW groundwater moving through the wetlands, and you have surface waters, SRO, surface runoff, going into the wetland itself. This will provide a very different environment for plants and organisms than, for example, a perched wetland, which is D on the bottom, where you don't really have regional groundwater moving in. You only have surface water running in and potentially precipitation. These types of systems will then have very different nutrient availability. So a system that has groundwater inputs typically have higher nutrient levels, and this will allow for different types of vegetation. So if you think of a cedar wetland, so the cedar swamp, those often have very high nutrient loads, which allow for the cedar to persist. If you go into a peatland, which have domination of mosses, those are typically lower in nutrients, or a black spruce wetland or swamp, those are also lower typically in nutrients. So what type of groundwater you have coming in, how the rain is coming in, greatly dictate what type of wetlands you will have. So you can shift between wetlands depending upon what type of disturbance is done on the landscape. In Canada, we have a very large amount of wetlands. So this map here shows wetland density across Canada, where the sort of brown areas, the sort of yellow areas have low wetland coverage. Outside of the boreal region, there are more wetlands in this upper section in Nunavut. But further south, you'll see dark blue regions in Northern Ontario, where upwards of 100% of the landscape is covered by wetlands. And it's common all the way across the country. So we have a lot of wetlands in Canada. So there's a lot of storage of water on the landscape, but also the potential for a lot of perturbation of these wetlands. As humans, we have disturbed these wetlands because they often provide a large amount of value outside of their ecological value. So this is a picture here in the Lower Mainland near Abbotsford. It's just a farm. I just plucked it off the internet. And we drain these wetlands to allow for farming. And it has produced a very highly productive agricultural system in the Lower Mainland. The soils present are the result of the wetlands that were present. So these are what we would call glycolic soils for the most part. They are a mineral soil with high organic content. But by draining them, we effectively have removed the processes that allowed that soil to develop. And you can actually start seeing it even in this picture. So I'm not certain you can see my pointer, but if you can see my pointer, I'm showing some dry areas just north of the drainage canal, and some dry areas here in the center portion of the field of the lower section. Some of these contrasts are due to water content, but likely what's also happened in these fields is the organic content has declined due to decomposition. So these organic matter in this wetlands existed because there was a reduction in the amount of oxygen entering into the soil. So this slowed decomposition and allowed the organic matter to build up, which can produce a very highly productive soil. Now that we've lowered the water table to allow for agriculture, the organic matter decomposes, and you start to see just the mineral component, the sands, silts, and clays being present in the soil. And this will ultimately reduce the productivity of the soil. And amendments will have to be put in, such as increases in organic matter, to try and improve the soils going forward. So I'd like you to think about that as we move forward and think about climate change, because carbon is the key component to climate change. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about climate change and BC. In general, depending on where you are in the province, I saw that we're sort of spread across the province with a number of people from the Thompson region. We're going to see higher annual precipitation and higher mean annual temperatures. That's sort of a broad sweeping stroke. We're going to have less snow and we're going to have more rain. So the rain will be persistent more in the winter months. And this is going to shift both the hydrology of our systems and the temperatures. So the temperature is going to rise, increasing evaporative demand, which will put pressure on the water levels of wetlands. And the shift in the precipitation will change the dynamics of how water gets into wetlands, which will shift how they function. I'm just going to give you a little example here just for KAMLOOPS. This is a modeling little exercise where we look at future climate in KAMLOOPS region. You can do this on a website out of Vancouver. The International Panel on Climate Change has a bunch of representative concentration pathways, which basically represent increases in energy going into the system. So the 8.5 pathway is a 4.3 degree temperature increase globally. This is what they classically call the business as usual scenario. So this is where we don't do a whole lot to try and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The other scenario I'll be showing is the 2.6, which is a 2 degree increase. This is above what the world targeted in the Paris Agreement to keep us below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are not going to meet that Paris Agreement in all likelihood. So our best case scenario might be the 2.6 at this point. And I was going to show you some of the temperature increases we can expect. So in these two figures, the left is the business as usual. This is where we don't do very much to mitigate climate change. And the right is where we do put some effort in. We don't meet the Paris Agreement, but we keep things at around 2 degrees globally. And what this graph is showing is a series of time. So going from black dots, which is past 1981 to 2010. The red is 2010 to 2039. So this is what we're in the middle of right now. The gray is 2040 to 2069. And the blue is 2070 to 2099. And these are mean annual daily maximum temperatures. And what you can see is the maximum temperatures during the summer months are going to shift, and they're already shifting, from the sort of mid-20 average mean daily high to mid-30s mean average daily high in the summer months. So this means we will be pushing into the 40-degree temperature range consistently over time in the future if we don't do anything to try and mitigate climate change, which means that heat dome that we saw a few years ago would become a fairly regular occurrence. If we do attempt to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, maybe not hit the climate change targets of the Paris Agreement, but meet the ones that are maybe around a 2.6 projection, which is a 2-degree increase globally, we can see we can keep our mean annual daily highs below 30 degrees in the summer months. This will greatly reduce evaporative losses from our wetlands and help maintain them on the landscape. Same thing if you look at snow. The left is the 8.5 or 4.3 degree increase, dramatic declines in snow in the winter months, whereas if we can sort of mitigate things, we'll maintain snowpacks better, which will allow for more water inputs later in the year as the snow melts. And lastly, precipitation is always a hard one with climate change. We don't model it particularly well. But again, you can see on the left one, increases in precipitation in the winter months, particularly increases in the springtime, declines during the dry season in the summer, and then a rise again through the fall. So we'll likely see a shift in when the rainfall occurs or precipitation occurs, and this will then impact water going into our wetlands. So our wetlands are going to experience pressure because they're going to experience both a change in the water availability, but also a change in the atmospheric demand of water due to evaporation. And the cause of this, and many of us I know realize on this call, realize that the fossil fuels are the primary driver, as burning fossil fuels have increased CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Other choices, such as poor use of nitrogen fertilizers, have increased N2O in the atmosphere, another major greenhouse gas. But what we often don't talk about enough is land use change. So approximately 20% of the increase in of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere are the result of land use change. This is due to forest clearing, which changes the dynamic of CO2 going into the atmosphere. This is due to agricultural practices, which have resulted in declines in soil carbon. And this is due to drainage of wetlands and their increase of CO2 going into the atmosphere. So I can show you this in this image here on the left. So this is like a little cartoon. The numbers in the boxes represent the gigatons of carbon in different locations. The atmosphere actually right now is probably closer to 800 gigatons. In this image here, it's 760. We have 550 gigatons in the vegetation. And we have about 2,400 gigatons in the soil. The arrows represent the exchange of carbon. So movement of carbon, for example, from the atmosphere to the vegetation is about 110 gigatons move into the vegetation through photosynthesis. And about 50 gigatons are returned due to respiration. The soil also is exchanging large amounts of carbon. 60 goes in about every year, and about 62 goes out into the atmosphere. And you can see on the right, the amount of fossil fuel burning is increasing the amount to the atmosphere by about 7.5. So the exchange of carbon from the soil to the atmosphere is about 8 times higher than what we as humans are putting in due to fossil fuel burning. So soils are a major key component to the climate change question, and keeping carbon in the soil, or actually increasing the carbon in the soil, is a critical component to mitigating climate change issues. So where is all the soil carbon stored? So this is what this map shows you here. As the colors range from a very light brown to a very dark brown, the amount of carbon in the soil increases. So there's lots of carbon being stored, for example, in the Amazon basin, Brazil, tropical forests, and middle portions of Africa. But if you look in the northern hemisphere, the carbon is primarily stored in the northern latitudes, in upper portions. So Canada has large amounts of carbon stores, Sweden, Finland, northern Russia, and most of this carbon is stored in wetlands. So I'm going to pivot to a certain type of wetland here. This is a peatland. Peatlands are an organic soil. So our soils have different types of classifications. Organic soils are effectively soils that are nearly 100% organic matter or dead plant material. And they exist because they have low oxygen in their soil, which allows for slow decomposition. And the amount of carbon being stored from photosynthesis exceeds the decomposition rate. So you get a continuous accumulation of carbon. So in this cartoon, you have the brown section, which has low decomposition due to the fact there's almost no oxygen in that soil. But an upper section, which does have aerobic decomposition, and you have growing plants. Well, typically it's often actually mosses. So these systems very slowly over time accumulate carbon, maybe a centimeter a year, and over thousands of years, it'll build up a layer of carbon. They exist because of their water budgets. So on the left is a bog peatland, the right is a fen peatland. This little cartoon shows you the inputs and outputs of water, and that's the key component that's maintaining these peatlands, along with low temperatures, which temperature is also associated with decomposition. So a bog peatland, so a bog is a peatland that has only rain inputs or precipitation inputs. So you have precipitation coming in the surface, you have evaporation going off the top, which is due to temperature, evaporative demand, and maybe you have stream flow coming off the surface, but there's no groundwater inputs. So these systems typically slowly accumulate carbon. They are very low pHs. You'll see black spruce growing on them, for example. And they will change due to these climate change effects. If you start to lower the water table, lowering of the water table increases the amount of oxygen in the system and it increases decomposition. So here's a typical peat soil on the left. This person is holding here. You see the moss on the top. You have some modest decomposition in the upper layer, and it slowly moves down to much more decomposed, much more compacted soils. And down in this lower section, you'll have very low oxygen levels and very, very slow decomposition. On the right, you see a drained peatland. They're draining the water out and they're effectively harvesting the peat for other purposes. So if you buy things like sphagnum moss or peat moss from the store, you're basically mined peatlands. They're basically taking the peat out of the soil and putting it in bags so you can put it in your garden. Canada has an enormous amount of peatlands. So Canada's peatlands alone store approximately 2 times the amount in the atmosphere of carbon in the atmosphere. So there's twice the amount just in our peatlands alone. And they exchange CO2 due to decomposition and methane. So when you don't have oxygen, the decomposition process changes. And instead of using oxygen, it uses other pathways, which produces methane. to the atmosphere, which is another type of greenhouse gas. And shifting the hydrology affects the methane production as well. So I was going to give you an example of some work that shows you this. This is work I did in Michigan. It's located in Upper Michigan. So down here is Michigan on the bottom here. Detroit off the picture on the bottom right. The dots in Upper Michigan. And here is Lake Superior, is the water body to the north, Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And this is a location of a peatland that has had some modifications. The water flows according to the direction of the arrows. In the 1900s, settlers moved in. They put a big drainage dike in. That's where those little red, those circle dots are. Those are called the Walsh ditch. They tried to drain it, turn it into agriculture. Unfortunately, the soil there has a pH of 3. So those of you familiar with nutrient dynamics, a pH of 3 is really poor soil for getting nutrients into plants. They all went broke. The farmers reverted to the state. The state in the 1930s built these dikes. That's what these brown lines are, for waterfowl to try and save trumpeter swans. Highly successful. They did a good job. They became a refuge. But by doing so, they also changed the way the water moved across the landscape. So here we're going to look at this little section near the bottom where it pokes out. There's a place called Marsh Creek Pool. And that's what you can see in this image here. The constructed dike in the 1930s, water ponded to the northern side of the dike, and it was dewatered on the southern side. So numbers 3 and 4 got wetter, numbers 5 and 6 got drier, and 2 and 1 had modest changes in the amount of water in the system. You can see pictures of those different ones. The left is the raised water table or the water pool. The middle is where it stayed the same, about the same. And on the right, it decreased in water table height. And these changes were modest. They only changed 10 centimeters as you moved across the screen. So the raised water table is 10 centimeters above the intermediate, and the lowered is 10 centimeters below the intermediate. And you're already in the pictures, you can see how things have changed. That little water table change resulted in trees growing in the lowered water table site, but not growing on the other sites, just because of a slight increase in the amount of oxygen in the soil, allowing for the roots. This then would theoretically change the amount of carbon present in the soil and the loss of carbon to the atmosphere. So we went out using some instrumentation. I won't go into how that works, but we can continuously effectively quantify the movement of CO2, methane, and water out of these systems from the surface to the atmosphere. And this is sort of the basic result that I can show. This is CO2 losses from the atmosphere into the ground. So the negative number represents losses of CO2 to the ecosystem, which just means the wetland is absorbing CO2. And there's 3 wetlands here. We have the lowered one, the raised, the intermediate, and the raised water tables. So the lowered one is the top line, the intermediate is the middle, and the raised is the lower. So the raised system, where the water table went up, increased its carbon storage because of a decrease in decomposition. Same thing happened the following year. The raised water table, because there's less oxygen in the soil, think back to that farmer's field that also was showing mineral soil. Again, a change in the oxygen levels resulted in changes in decomposition. So much so that the lowered water table actually started to decompose. And well, it did a couple things. It also collapsed a little bit because the water was gone. So you wind up with these sort of changes in your carbon dynamics in these systems. And these small perturbations can have dramatic shifts in the amount of CO2 held, or carbon held, by the wetlands. And we see this across Canada. Now, if you think of permafrost regions, we're seeing many of those regions we saw, where all those wetlands were in Canada. They're all in northern regions. We have a lot of permafrost in those locations. Because of climate change, the permafrost is collapsing because it's melting. So you have this permafrost basically buoying the surface. It melts, it collapses. You can see that on the left here, these brown sections are forming sort of open water wetlands. And that is primarily because of the collapse of the peat, sorry, of the permafrost. The melting ice releases methane that's trapped as bubbles in the ice, which goes to the atmosphere, which is an issue. And the change in the hydrology, and each system's different. So I showed you when we saw a decline, an increase in carbon storage with raised water tables. That doesn't mean that happens in these locations. You'll see a change in the carbon dynamics, which will then change the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere. On the right, this is some, you can see black spruce. The black spruce are kind of wobbly in these pictures, and this is what sort of it's called a drunken tree syndrome. It's not really a syndrome so much as that the permafrost below is melting and the trees start to wobble because the ground below them becomes unstable. And this happens for all sorts of reasons. One is just temperature increases causing melt of permafrost. It also happens if you cut the trees down, you change the amount of sunlight reaching the surface, which adds energy, also causes melt. And this can accelerate permafrost losses. So this could be due to timber harvesting. We see this happening in regions where we put seismic lines in to do gas exploration. When you remove the trees, you increase the solar loads. This melts the permafrost and causes a shift in the water dynamics, which are key to the wetlands development and sustaining the wetland. So this is a sort of general conclusion. I hope you understand from this talk that wetlands type and location depend on the local hydrology. And that local hydrology will dictate the amount of nutrients going in. It will also dictate the timing and the depth of the water, which will control the type of wetlands you may have. The climate will dictate how much precipitation you have, what vegetation can persist in those locations. It will control how fast decomposition goes as well because it changes temperature. Wetlands will be affected by climate change, and you can see that in a collapsing permafrost. It will change the hydrology of the systems, which will alter the water inputs. It will change the rate of decomposition by changes in temperature. But also wetlands are key to the climate change question. They have exceptional amounts of carbon stored in them. As that carbon decomposes, it will add CO2 to the atmosphere and can potentially accelerate climate change. Or if we get more storage into our soil, we can actually reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and then decrease the potential implications of climate change. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Danielle, we appear to have lost your audio.
Yeah,
I'm back. It would help if I pressed the button. Apologies. Tom, thanks so much for your presentation. It was very clear and really informative. Really appreciate that. We have a couple questions. Mary Ellen asks, how do we manage wetlands that have controlled water systems, example, weirs and dams that might influence? I think she's speaking about Polson Park wetland in Vernon in particular.
so some of our wetlands we've actually constructed, and we've actually done it with weirs and dams, so they may not have actually existed previously. And now those weirs and dams are what's actually maintaining that wetland on the landscape. Each wetland's going to be different. I'm not familiar with that particular wetland, so I can't say how to do that particular wetland. But the goal, hopefully, of whoever is controlling those weirs and dams is to ask what type of habitat system are we looking for, and managing the water in those systems to maintain the water that is appropriate for that particular type of wetland. That's the furthest I can kind of go on that. If you're looking for climate change, you do need to start asking how the water table is affecting the storage of carbon in those systems. But that, again, would be a site-specific question.
Great, thanks for that. Jennifer asks, we have a farm out in Sorrento and CP Rail has a right of way through part of it. The rail bed is raised as it goes through a wetland area. A beaver has been living in the wetland behind the rail bed. This is a problem for CP and they're trying to trap it. The beaver keeps our groundwater at a level to sub-irrigate our fields. How do we work with CP?
Oh, that's a challenging one. And you're right. So first of all, this is one of the classic ways we disturb wetlands, and you can see this all over the place where a wetland a road, whether it's a road or a railway, cuts across a wetland. This tends to pond water up on one side and dewater the other side. And you can really see this when you're driving along any road. If you're driving and you see a whole bunch of dead trees on one side of the road and it's standing water, it's likely because they've interrupted some sort of surface flow, and then it dewaters on the other side. The Coquihalla is a great, I take my students sometimes to a site along the Coquihalla where they dewatered a wetland and there's this very large soil column of peat that's now been exposed and decomposing. The beavers also do interesting things. They cause challenges, and it sounds like CP in this case doesn't like it because it's probably flooding their railway tracks. I'm not certain. And they also act as a way of storing water and trying to slow down the loss of water from a system. And we as humans don't like this. We generally speaking try to move water out as fast as possible. This causes us some problems in other ways, which we can get into, like flooding issues. But in terms of CP, I'm not certain how to work with CP. I can't give you exact advice on how to talk to CP themselves, but I do understand that the importance of both the organisms, the beavers, as well as how the train tracks may have already affected the water flow. Trying to point out to them the importance of the water, I would say, be useful, but CP has its own set of rules, and there's a fair bit of favorable laws in terms of their ability to alter things on the landscape. So I wish I had better answer to you other than try and talk to them and maybe talk to your MPP about it as well. That would be another place to go.
Great, thanks, Tom. Oh, there's another question in here. Just a reminder, please do put your chat or your questions in the chat. Nikki has a question. Is it possible at this point to determine how long monitoring and data collection should be performed on any individual wetlands before construction when it is impacted on all sides by human activities when we're looking to increase carbon sequestration and mitigate impacts of climate change like flooding? Lots of individual projects without regional plans.
Yeah, so one of the challenges for sure with wetlands is they're not particularly well mapped out by the province. So if you go and look at a map, it may show locations, but if you go to the site, you'll actually find other wetlands present. I think the first key part is to make sure the wetland is properly delineated. So there are ways to do that. Wetlands have certain types of soil, certain types of vegetation, which give you an indication of where the typical high water mark for that wetland is. The challenge comes in is how does the upland development affect the water supply to the wetland? And that often requires more understanding. I think in general, we probably don't spend enough time to figure that out because people need to figure out whether they can build. And they typically will just tell people you can't build within the wetland. You need to build off the wetland site. And I think right now it's challenging to get much more than just that basic delineation being done. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for exactly how long do we need to monitor. As a scientist, I like to monitor for a very long time, but we're normally not given that opportunity.
Great, thanks for that. Fox has another question, or has a question. Is there a way to clean wetlands? I live in Vancouver and lagoons and lakes here are filthy. Does the cleanliness of wetlands affect the carbon capture?
That's a great question. the first one I would go towards in terms of cleaning a wetland is to identify what source is actually making it quote unquote dirty. So if it's in an agricultural setting, are we loading it with nitrogen or phosphorus due to excess fertilizer? Just as an example. So I would first go towards what's causing the issue, try to work to mitigate that issue. And then over time, hopefully the wetland can actually clean itself as it works through those nutrient loads. So the key, often one of the problems is nutrient load. So the key is to cut off the nutrient load. That will then alter the way the system's functioning, and then you can hopefully have the wetland clean itself up over time. Because one of the awesome things with wetlands is we can actually construct wetlands to deal with things we don't want as well. So wetlands can be built in urban environments, for example, to deal with pollutants, to stop them from moving out into other water bodies. So they do have a great ability, often a great ability to manage them. But if the source keeps on reoccurring, the wetland's not going to get better.
Thanks for that. I'm not sure if I don't see other questions. I do have a question. Again, if you have any other questions, please do put them into the Q&A. Tom, how well do we understand the role of wetlands in the climate change cycle?
So wetlands right now are a very popular topic for research. And part of the issue is understanding, as I went through this talk, that dynamic between water table height, temperature, and water storage. And there's two components that make it complicated. One is the CO2 storage due to photosynthesis and holding it through plant material. And the second is methane. So methane is released from these systems. And how that water table height changes will change the dynamic between CO2 and methane. And methane is 23 times more of a greenhouse gas than CO2. So each molecule of methane is equivalent to 23 molecules or 25 molecules of CO2. So we don't fully understand that really well. So there's a lot of work trying to figure out these different dynamics and how disturbance will affect those two, but those are the two key elements. So if, just like an example, if you go to there are some locations in wetlands, if you go out with a match and light it above the wetlands, you'll actually get a flame burn off from the methane coming out of it. So there's some locations with lots of methane coming out.
Interesting. Thank you. Any other further questions? This might be an excellent opportunity too, just to maybe share that the TNCC and the Okanagan Collaborative Conservation Program is working on a project called the Conservation Planning for Climate Change. And the goal of this project is to combine Indigenous ecological and cultural knowledge and Western science to identify those important conservation areas for wetlands and grasslands. And we will be working with Indigenous communities and local governments on identifying where changes to policy are needed or new policy is needed. The project will support the identification and subsequent protection of the region's biodiversity and habitat connectivity, and ultimately support what we hope is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So stay tuned for information on that. I do see something else in the chat, just a link. Ali put a link into that project on our website. I think that's probably a great place to wrap. Thanks everybody for attending. Thank you so much, Tom, for your presentation. It has been super informative, and we're really happy to have you kick off the first of TNCC's webinars. If everyone could please take a moment to complete the evaluation of this webinar. The link is in the chat, and the survey should open in your web browser as soon as the webinar ends. And thank you again. And also don't forget to sign up for TNCC's monthly newsletter if you're interested, to stay posted on our next learning opportunities. Thanks again, Tom. I really appreciate you taking the time today, and everybody else for joining.
Thank you very much. And Mandy, I saw you made a note, so feel free to contact me. I'm at TRU. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much.